Okay, so we're going to quickly wrap up the unit and finish out talking about Grover Cleveland's second administration. So remember, in 1892, Cleveland was elected for the second time. And coming into office in after his inauguration in 1893, he is promptly greeted with the Panic of 1893, an economic depression caused by Benjamin Harrison's absolutely abysmal silver policy. Um, with the economy collapsing and the government running out of gold, the idea was proposed that Cleveland should put America on a bimetallic standard. He absolutely refused to do it. This alienated many of his own party members. And this is when he goes to J.P. Morgan and gets Morgan to loan the government 3.5 million ounces of gold in exchange for the government bonds. Now, the economic problem of the Panic of 1893 is compounded by the impact it had on labor. There are a group of dissatisfied workers who get together as literally like an army of angry workers, nearly 50,000 of them, I think, who decide that they're going to march on Washington, D.C. in protest. They're going to go on a 200-mile trek, and they're going to show up in D.C. and make known their unhappiness. Cleveland gets wind of this and actually has the city set up and fortified by the army to defend itself against what looks to be an impending invasion. As things progress, trying to get that many people to walk 200 miles ain't really going to work that well. It ends up being like maybe 1,000 people or something with some like stray animals that they pick up that come there. But when they are confronted by like literally Washington, D.C., ready for a full scale war, they leave and go home with their issues unaired and unresolved, and they're angry. Additionally, you have the Pullman strike, which involved the Pullman luxury rail car company of Chicago. So the Pullman Company, which was, by the way, the largest employer of African Americans at the time, the Pullman Company had its own railroad workers. They were Pullman porters, and you also have the workers at the factory. Now, when you went to work for Pullman, you didn't just get a job. Pullman built his own town right outside of Chicago where his factory was located. And he named the town Pullman, Illinois. Go figure. You got a house, your kids went to school, you got clothes, you got everything you could need. That's what you got. What you didn't get was cash. Instead, he provided you with credit, like a credit card that could only be used in Pullman, which had shops, bars, and taverns, and restaurants, and motels, and stores, and food, and churches, and banks, all owned by Pullman. And you could use your Pullman credit at anything you wanted there. But the downside of it is that all the prices in Pullman's town were like 3 times higher than they would be in Chicago. So, with the economy going as bad as it was, it probably should be no surprise that Pullman announced that he was lowering wages and actually raising the cost of items in Pullman, Illinois. This did not sit well with the workers, who then went on strike. And because we're talking about Chicago, which, if you guys can remember, was actually like the railroad hub of the United States, this strike did not just affect Pullman, nor even the city of Chicago, but they refused to let any trains into Chicago or out of Chicago, which meant that like 3/4 of all the railroad traffic in the country was ground to a halt. So Pullman contacts Cleveland and says, "We have a problem. What are we going to do about this?" And Cleveland said, "We don't have a problem. You have a problem. What are you going to do about it?" So let's look at an evil genius move right here. Imagine for a moment that there's a four-way intersection in a city. And at this four-way stop, 4 stop signs, 4 vehicles arrive at the exact same time. So that you can't go by the rule of who's ever on the right gets to go first, because everybody's on the right of everybody else, and they all came first the same time. Those four vehicles are a fire truck with its lights on its way to a house fire. Let's say even an orphanage fire with a giant building full of children burning. The second vehicle is a police car in hot pursuit of a car that kidnapped children from that orphanage and then lit the orphanage on fire. The third vehicle is an ambulance carrying children who are going to die from that fire to a hospital if they don't get to that hospital immediately. The fourth vehicle is a U.S. mail truck, a postal truck. The postal truck gets to go before anybody else. That's because the mail is a federal issue. So what Pullman did was he put train cars of U.S. mail on every train in Chicago. And then when the strikers blocked those trains, he called President Cleveland up and said, "You have a problem going on, Mr. President. What are you going to do to fix it?" And Cleveland was forced to come in and break the strike up, which did not sit well with the strikers. But again, it's just what you do when you've got a problem like that. Now, if this isn't all bad enough, there is also the issue of the fact that Cleveland has cancer that he discovers in 1893. And while all these other problems here are going on, he suddenly makes the very bizarre announcement that he and his family are going on a Caribbean cruise for a couple of months. Goodbye. And people are like, why? You can't do that. What are we going to do? And so here's the thing. 150 years ago, nobody knew that Cleveland had cancer. This isn't like today where like the president stubs his toe and there's 25 people there with streaming like the president stubs his toe things. With the situation back then, Cleveland got on his vacation cruise, and that vacation cruise was taken on a Navy hospital ship, and he sailed around the Caribbean and the Atlantic for a while in order to recover from the successful cancer operation. But it was a hard year for him. Now, there are some areas of Cleveland's in this second term that are very successful, but not without their own peculiar set of issues. One of those is the question of foreign policy. And let's look briefly at the island of Hawaii, which was a U.S. territory. Hawaii had been an independent kingdom, ruled by a monarch, the very longly syllabled Liliuokalani. Now, in the 1870s and 80s, American plantation owners began buying up large chunks of Hawaii for sugar plantations. And this is what they did. Hawaii became the center for sugar plantations. One of the problems with this is that by the 1880s, these plantations employed over half of all the Hawaiians. And Queen Lil was not overly comfortable with her countrymen being dependent on foreign countries for business. So she went and did something about it. She decided to throw out all of the plantation owners, which she did. In response, the plantation owners organized the Hawaiian workers and overthrew the queen and petitioned for the ability to join the U.S. as a territory, which Benjamin Harrison granted them. Now, fast forward. The queen is not happy about this. She doesn't like getting thrown out of her own country. She begins complaining, and she complains to the newly elected Grover Cleveland, who says, "You're absolutely right. You should have your country back. By the way, Madam Queen, Your Majesty, what are you going to do with the people involved with this?" And she's like, "I'm going to execute all of them." And Cleveland is like, "You realize they're U.S. citizens, and that's a problem?" "No, it's not. I'm going to execute them." Okay. Cleveland can't let her kill off large numbers of American citizens, so he lets the overthrow go through. He makes Hawaii, however, an independent country, the Republic of Hawaii, which lasts until the next president, William McKinley, comes in, and then they promptly go back to being a U.S. territory. Now, in something that is in his control, but is kind of out of character, because remember, again, he was an isolationist and an America First guy. The issue of the revival of the Monroe Doctrine, that weird little foreign policy idea that was instituted under President James Monroe in 1825 that said that America would no longer allow Europe to colonize and it wanted Europe out of North and South America. In the 1890s, Britain and Venezuela almost went to war over the issue of where the border of Venezuela was. The U.S. steps in and threatened to attack England if the British declared war on Venezuela. And instead, the U.S. offered to be an arbiter, there's that arbitration thing again, and look at the dispute and see who was actually correct. And as it turned out that the British and the Venezuelans went along with this, the British actually were correct on this. But it was a big step forward for us, and it showed that the U.S. was not going to, allow countries to push us around like this or do anything in the Western Hemisphere. Now, it's during Cleveland's administration that the Navy is finally modernized and finished. Initially, the Navy had built a grand total of 2 brand new battleships and some smaller boats, which would allow us to defend ourselves in the event of a war with Brazil. Cleveland didn't think that that was quite good enough, and he wanted a Navy that could actually fight if we wanted to declare war on somebody. And so the Navy did build some more ships and put us on a par with most European countries. Not to be outdone, the Army wanted to be improved and updated. So the Army was equipped with the newly purchased bolt-action Krag-Jorgensen rifle, just like European nations. We'll talk about the problems with the Krag-Jorgensen in the next unit. These changes resulted in massive deficits and large debts being run up. By the end of his term, Cleveland wants nothing to do with politics anymore. He is angry and disgusted, particularly with his own party for their views, and he leaves, which is fine because the Democrats don't want him anyways at this point. The end of Cleveland's term is a shift in the Democratic Party's approach to things. Cleveland will be the last really conservative Democrat elected ever. About the closest you get might be Harry Truman in 1946, in 48, or maybe John F. Kennedy in 1960. Okay, let's wrap this up. So the period of time we're talking about, which was roughly 1877 to 1892, is a period of growth and change. Reform just means to fix. They fixed government with the institution of civil service reform and the idea of merit-based jobs. They fixed the economy with getting rid of the pesky greenbacks. Labor's situation was greatly helped by the development of the 2 big nationwide unions, the Knights of Labor, and after them, more significantly, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. It's also, unfortunately, a time of radicalism, where new, really scary political ideas make their way into America and become more and more popular among people, largely due to dissatisfaction. It's a time of economic radicalism, too. The efforts to change America's economy to go onto a silver-based economy rather than a gold-based, and different business structures being put in place that really proved to be a challenge for how America's economy functioned. It's also a change in political parties. The end of Grover Cleveland's second term signals a decision on the part of the Democrats to become much more open to liberal progressive ideas, to drift to the left. And while the Republicans may have those elements in them, more Republicans begin developing these very conservative, sort of almost like Grover Cleveland-esque ideas. And we'll hit all of those when we hit in the next chapter. So, thanks again. We'll see you for our quest tomorrow, and you are finito with this one. Peace and love.